Max Verstappen is a 4-time F1 World Champion, and this title has really been earned the hard way. Wrapping things up with 2 races to go means the final standings will reflect very well on Verstappen once again. It has been an excellent season, but if anything, the points totals and the wins column do him a disservice. A season that hinted at total Red Bull domination, with Verstappen's early 2024 form ended up needing a massive effort to get the title over the line. While a full-on fight never quite materialised, the threat from McLaren and Lando Norris was real, and what it asked of Verstappen and Red Bull was huge. So even if the final margin looks comfortable, the fact is this championship could have been snatched away from Verstappen had a few things gone differently, and that mix of factors makes this a title that Verstappen and Red Bull won as much as McLaren and Norris lost. Verstappen sealing the deal before the season ended would have been no surprise at all back in April, when a dominant Chinese Grand Prix weekend made it 4 wins and a sprint race victory from 5 events. Things have been different since then. Since the first race after China in Miami, Verstappen has been F1's top scorer, but it's been extremely close with Norris, and since the summer break, he's trailed the McLaren driver. McLaren and Red Bull have been on different trajectories. Verstappen was able to make hay while the sun shone early in the year, as Red Bull did exactly what McLaren feared. It cashed in on its dominant 2023, which allowed it to hold back development in the second half of that year to put a load of effort into its 2024 car and move the goalposts. McLaren, by contrast, had to wait until round 6 to get everything it wanted onto its car, and it couldn't have really sped that process up because that Miami upgrade was the sum of a gradual acquisition of knowledge over the winter and even into the start of the season. That cost Norris ground early on, and even when McLaren stepped forward, it took a while to start really paying off. It was neck and neck with Red Bull through the middle phase of the year, with Ferrari and Mercedes interloping, and it was only just before the summer break that McLaren started to consistently have the best all-round car. There have been standout weekends of McLaren dominance like Hungary, Zandvoort and Singapore, but it was a massive ask to make up so much ground on a driver of Verstappen's quality, even if Norris and McLaren did a perfect job all of the time, which they didn't, as we'll explain shortly. Ultimately, that early spell of races bought Verstappen precious breathing room when things got difficult. When the run-in was still looking tense, Verstappen was looking back regretfully at his retirement in Australia. He said it was very painful to have lost 25 points there, given how much stronger it would have made his position. But the Melbourne DNF was, at the time, McLaren wasn't yet ready to win, as Norris was only 3rd behind the 2 Ferraris, and in the end it hasn't mattered, whereas the points Verstappen did earn early on proved to be a crucial enough buffer. Norris admits it's a fact that he and McLaren haven't capitalised on all their chances this year, even though he disagrees with the perception some have about how wasteful they've been. One key difference between Verstappen and Norris though is the sheer number of times you can say they didn't win a race they could have. We'll come to Verstappen's strike rate in a moment. If there was a common theme to Norris's missed opportunities, it was not converting mega qualifying performances into even holding the lead into the first corner. Only 2 of Norris's 3 race wins so far have been earned from his 7 pole positions. That's 5 obvious missed opportunities right there. He lost critical ground at the start that stopped him winning in Spain and Hungary, even though Norris feels his starts weren't actually that bad at those races. Norris was also jumped at the start in the wet in Brazil. Even when he has held the lead off the line, Norris has sometimes been too soft afterwards. He was outmuscled by teammate Oscar Piastri on the opening lap in Italy and was too naive into the first corner in the United States, giving Verstappen the chance to bully him off track. The pole to win ratio doesn't even take into account the chances Norris had to win races he didn't start from pole at, in Canada and in Britain, 2 races where strategic hesitations in mixed conditions cost McLaren and Norris dearly. Other errors have also contributed to drop points, like running wide at the first corner at Spa or the mistake at the restart in Brazil. McLaren's occasional lack of sharpness at the front, its sometimes not quite optimised start procedures and launch mapping, and Norris not always being as ruthless as he needed to be, ultimately exposed the inexperience he and this version of McLaren have in title fights. It also reflects that they found themselves in a potential championship battle sooner than they expected and weren't quite ready for it this time. There have been plenty of moments this year where Red Bull and Verstappen have, together or individually, shown just why they've been at the top of the tree for the last few seasons. Red Bull's crisp communication and clear decision making put McLaren to shame with a sharper reaction to the safety car in Canada and a better reading of the tyre situation in changing conditions at Silverstone. It hasn't always been perfect. Uncharacteristically slow pit stops and wrong strategy calls have left Verstappen very frustrated at times, most notably in Hungary, but Red Bull has often handled crunch situations perfectly. Verstappen has dropped points this year and had the odd slip of self-control, but they are still precious exceptions, and he has been, in a single word, relentless. Sometimes that's come in the form of some hugely significant victories, like how he soaked up massive pressure to win at Imola and in Spain, was faultless in Canada, or put in an all-time great performance in the wet in Brazil. And those Spain-Canada wins in June feel particularly important, given they were directly at Norris's expense. That's a 28-point swing that had a massive impact on Verstappen's championship lead and keeping Norris at arm's length. Had it gone the other way, the second half of the season would have had a very different context. But it's not just the wins. Think also of his 4.5-month victory drought and results like finishing second at Silverstone, fourth at Spa and beating Norris despite starting 11th, and second in Singapore to a dominant Norris to end a really tricky run of races when Red Bull was at its weakest. Verstappen's damage limitation has been excellent. Even when Norris was finally starting to make some inroads, Verstappen was stemming the tide, and has almost always been ready to pounce on mistakes from his would-be rival. Verstappen's uncompromising approach to racing means that whether by accident or design, he takes F1's racing rules to the extreme and sometimes crosses the line. That wins him a lot of fans and a lot of critics. This year, it also earned him a few important points against Norris. They only collided properly in Austria, where Verstappen looked shaky after losing control of the race and was aggressive in his defence, but Norris also misjudged a couple of things in that fight himself. This all ended in a needless clash that proved more costly for Norris because he was the one who looked more likely to snatch the victory, and from a championship perspective, he was the one who lost more ground. A DNF for Norris meant that while Verstappen maybe lost a win and definitely a guaranteed podium, he still strengthened his position that day. Then there were the controversial wheel-to-wheel flare-ups in the US and Mexico. In Austin, Verstappen forced Norris wide at the first corner with an aggressive borderline move that Norris shouldn't have left himself vulnerable to. Later in the race, after excellent defending lap after lap, Verstappen pulled off another borderline move in defence that went unpunished, and Norris, who slightly naively kept trying to pass Verstappen around the outside, actually got a penalty for overtaking off the track. Much as some may dislike it, the rules were just about on Verstappen's side in the US, and he extended his lead over Norris again. And even though he copped 2 penalties for 2 incidents after just a couple of corners apart a week after this in Mexico, Verstappen still may have been better off for it. Serving a 20-second time penalty for forcing Norris off and then a desperate lunge to unfairly get back ahead didn't reflect great on Verstappen, but the time loss it cost Norris may well have stopped Norris winning. If so, that relative points gain was actually worth more than what Verstappen realistically lost directly through his penalties. Norris has even admitted that he wasn't quite at Verstappen's standard in battle this year, and the controversial clashes helped Max, who came out on top more often than not. That had tangible rewards in terms of points, and also intangible benefits like establishing a certain power dynamic in their rivalry. The second Red Bull and the second McLaren have been very prominent in certain narratives this season, but for very different reasons, because Sergio Perez and Oscar Piastri have played contrasting roles for their teams. Perez was a pretty effective rear gunner for Verstappen early on, finishing second in 3 of the first 4 races, but he's not been on the podium since April's Chinese Grand Prix and has disappeared entirely from championship relevance. He's let Red Bull down in the Constructors' contest and been a complete non-factor in Verstappen's bid, unable to take points off Norris. The minor upside was it meant Verstappen retained Red Bull's entire focus, and when things got tight on individual upgrades like a late season new floor, it inevitably went to Verstappen to help his cause. Things were more complicated at McLaren. After the very minor matter of the team not moving Piastri aside in the Austria sprint race with the cars second and third, the drivers had their first real flashpoint in Hungary. Piastri robustly passed Norris at the start, then had to wait later in the race for Norris to finally cede to a command to let Piastri back past, having inadvertently been moved ahead by McLaren's strategic management of the race. McLaren was criticised for not prioritising Norris. Then another forceful but fair Piastri move on Norris followed after the summer break in Italy, a race Piastri was poised to win instead of Norris before McLaren was somehow gazumped by Charles Leclerc's one-stopping Ferrari, and Piastri was then allowed to stay second with Norris third. Piastri did eventually get moved into more of a support role, which bought Norris a couple of points in the US when Piastri backed off to avoid Norris losing another place with his time penalty, and a single point in Brazil when Piastri gave him the sprint race win there. The net cost over all of that was pretty small, as few as 8 points, as many as 15 if you're assuming Norris could have beaten Leclerc at Monza had he been the McLaren driver who stayed in front at the start of the race. Minor points or not, it did influence the situation and gave McLaren a headache to manage at times instead of being all in on Norris. And these are just examples of the cars running together on track. There were other occasions Piastri beat Norris by a few positions, like Saudi Arabia, Monaco, Belgium and Azerbaijan. These can't count as points McLaren and Piastri directly cost Norris, but purely in terms of numbers, if Piastri didn't exist in these races or drastic action were taken and he dropped back several places, Norris would have gained a little more on Verstappen. That's what happens when a title-fighting driver has a competitive teammate. Whereas at Red Bull, the reality is that Perez has taken absolutely 0 points off Verstappen this year. The only race he even threatened to do that was Azerbaijan, where he had a late crash with Carlos Sainz anyway. Going from 7 consecutive Verstappen poles to start the year to just 1 for Verstappen after the Imola round in May shows how much the pecking order changed in 2024. For all that we've said about how much Red Bull and Verstappen found themselves on the back foot throughout the season, it's worth stressing how they rebounded in the final third. The middle phase of the year was definitely Red Bull's weakest, but it was also the most valuable, as it did genuinely seem to emerge with a greater understanding of its limitations and work to start correcting them, with its worst weekend of the year at Monza key to that. A few races later, a new flaw in Austin helped pull Red Bull back from a brief spell of only being the 4th fastest team. Unsurprisingly, Verstappen used that to good effect. Red Bull still didn't have the fastest car anymore, but it was more in the ballpark again, and Verstappen could at least fight more often. It was in the final part of the year that Red Bull also tried to catch various potentially illegal methods rival teams had used to steal a march, including flexi wings, alleged tyre cooling tricks, and abuse of floor plank rules to run lower. Various matters were reported to the FIA in what felt like a show to Verstappen that it was doing all it could to support him as much as it was anything else, and Red Bull feels it reined in its main rivals a little bit by doing so. Only a few people will really know the answer to that, but there's no denying Verstappen had a car that was at least capable of finishing with a relative flourish rather than just limping to the title, and Verstappen took full advantage. He didn't officially seal the championship in Brazil, but he effectively won it there with a mega drive from the back of the grid in the wet that flipped the script from Norris being poised to make a massive gain to Verstappen being on the brink of the title, one that he sealed at the very next race in Las Vegas. Getting back into a position to do that is a testament to Red Bull's tenacity and the mental robustness and skill of its newly crowned world champion.